We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming to the second guest lecture of our semester. We have two more after this. Today we are very happy to have Rear Admiral Ann Phillips joining us today. Ann served 31 years on active duty in the U.S. Navy. She then pursued an MBA at the College of William & Mary, where she chaired the Infrastructure Working Group for the Hampton Roads Sea Level Rise, Preparedness and Resilience Intergovernmental Pilot Planning Project, which was essentially a community project that was seeking to, one, address sea level rise in the Hampton Roads region, but also to sort of serve as a template for coastal communities. And now a member of the advisory board for the Center for Climate Security, which is an institute, and we'll hopefully talk about this in a little more detail, but an institute that focuses on analysis and policy related to how climate change affects national security. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ann, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. So thank you, and good evening, everybody, or good late afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Is this working well enough? Yes? Okay, thank you, because I don't have a voice that will carry in this circumstance, so I will need the mic. So I'm honored to be here with all of you today to talk about coastal adaptation and protection in Virginia, with a little bit of emphasis on national security aspects of climate, and in particular how it's impacting, or how it will impact, the state of Virginia, and what the state is trying to do about it, and how I came to be in my current position as Special Assistant to the Governor for Coastal Adaptation and Protection, which is a new position, and we'll talk about that as we get a little bit farther into the brief. As mentioned during the kind introduction, thank you very much. I'm retired Navy. I got into this after I retired. I drove ships for 31 years, so cared about infrastructure, really only in the context of, do I have internet when I get to the pier? And is someone going to be there to make sure I can refuel if I need to? And really having internet was the most important thing. Which kind of gets to the larger context of the military and whether or not it cares about infrastructure. But after having the opportunity to participate in this two-year pilot project, I realized that some of the things that had always puzzled me about where I lived in Hampton Roads were of great import. And those two things were, why, whenever it rains, does the whole place submerge? And why do I live in a city that's not in a county? Those two things turn out to be the heart of a lot of the challenges. We are sinking along coastal Virginia, and the water is rising as a result, and in addition to, so those two challenges exist that are somewhat unique to us, more so than other regions, particularly on the East Coast. And we have interesting legislative standards in the state of Virginia, the Dillon Rule being one of them, which means that cities receive their power and authority expressly and only as dictated by the government, the state government, and that they may not exceed that authority, particularly in the context of collaborating without special authority or permission from the state government. And we also have something that's unique in the country, really, independent cities. And independent cities, in the way in which they are interpreted in the state of Virginia, there are 38 of them. 10 are in Hampton Roads alone, in the Hampton Roads Planning District. The only other 3 cities that I can find that meet the kind of definition of independence nationwide are Reno, Nevada, St. Louis, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. So Virginia has this really interesting and unique circumstance in that regard, too. And while it gives the cities considerable independence in their own right, it also creates stovepipes of excellence and a tendency to not want to share and collaborate. And that is a challenge when we're dealing with climate impacts, because, of course, they're not going to restrict themselves to any particular boundary at all. So I think part of the challenge that we're facing here in Virginia is the state has taken actions in the past to look at climate impact. We did a climate assessment in 2008 under then Governor Kane's administration. A lot of excellent work was done by some of the coastal planning district commissions, Hampton Roads in particular, in the 2012-2013 timeframe. Virginia Institute of Marine Science has done excellent work on predicting recurrent flooding and sea level rise and how it uniquely applies to the state of Virginia. But then We go from, because the issue has become polarized in a political way, we've seen, action, 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 no action, can't talk about it, it's not happening, don't call it sea level rise, maybe you can call it recurrent flooding. Oh, okay, we're back to action. Well, in the Navy, when you shift a rudder like that, guess what happens? Nothing. And so, in my opinion, what we're seeing in the state of Virginia is we're just recovering from this. We're moving, we're not moving, now we're starting to move again. So Governor McAuliffe certainly was interested in this. He restarted a number of actions in the context of preparing for climate, but he was very much focused on energy. Governor Northam wants to do a little bit more in the resilience context. And last year, under the General Assembly, my position was created, Special Assistant for Coastal Adaptation and Protection. I'm honored to be the first person in that job. And because it is created under state law, I won't be the last, and that's a good thing. Let's see if I can move forward. I'd like to talk a little bit about the national security piece, because I think that's kind of something that's unique. Unfortunately or unfortunately, it is quite a hot topic in the news these days, depending on what news you're listening to. This afternoon, as I was heading here, I was desperately trying to find something that was not Michael Cohen talking, and I was having trouble, I can tell you. Nearly every station was carrying that, but eventually I was successful. So from the broader perspective of climate as an impactor to national security, there's this context of that we as a nation, and actually the national security apparatus, has a long history of acknowledging climate change from the mid-90s on, in national security doctrines and Arctic strategies, in Navy strategies, in reports put out by the Center for Naval Analysis, looking at the impact of climate on military activities, and acknowledging that climate is a threat multiplier, in that it takes existing threats and makes them more numerous, and also, I would add, a threat magnifier. It makes those threats more challenging and more damaging and more of an impactor on our ability to execute our national security strategy, both at home and abroad. So we live in a time of unprecedented risk, but we also are beginning to have unprecedented foresight in the context of the science and engineering that understands and analyzes this work, beginning to come to an agreement, a consensus on the fact that we need to move forward, and to some extent, the manners in which we might consider moving forward. So this is a slide from really a year ago. It was the actual date was February 19 and 20, 2018. And in the context of that particular, for those who are maybe oceanographers in the room, was that for a substantial period over those 2 days, the Arctic was at a temperature above freezing, which is highly unusual, 40 degrees above normal. And the other interesting circumstance that had happened around that time last year was that the ice-hardened Russian liquid natural gas carrier, the Christophe de Margerie, transited the northern sea route alone, in the dark, without an escort, and did it, much faster, 19 days faster than she would have if she went through the Suez. So she went around to Korea through the northern sea route by herself in the dark, ice-free. So that is a substantial change to the Arctic that we are used to dealing with. And that kind of circumstance has remained. The Navy this year, Secretary Spencer, in 2019, last year, late 2018, announced that he was going to change and update our Arctic strategy again, which we had just updated in 2016. And the reason he wanted to do it is because there was so much open water in the Arctic. His exact quote is, "The damn thing melted," which was said in front of testimony in the, I don't know if he was in the House or the Senate, but in reality, that is true. There's a lot more open water now, and there is a need for presence and for understanding and acknowledging what's happening in the Arctic region from a national security perspective. Those of you who study this from a political science perspective know that there is an Arctic Council. It consists of the 8 Arctic nations and other interested parties. It's been in existence for quite some time, and it has done excellent work in resolving how to control and prepare for oil and fuel spills as one example, how to prepare for search and rescue missions as another, but it does not have a hard security context. It does not have a defense piece to it. It is strictly more of an economic and I would say political body, but to come to agreements among countries, but not with a hard security perspective. So as we see, this is just one change from a global perspective, where we're seeing dramatic differences in areas that we have not traditionally operated, where we will need to reframe our abilities as a nation, as will other nations, to be able to operate in that region. Now, having said that, the Russians have a number of icebreakers. We have two. Many other nations have a lot more exposure and experience operating in the Arctic. Secretary Spencer is interested in sending surface ships to the Arctic region in the summer to start to operate. We did participate in last fall in an exercise we used to spend a lot of time in Norway. We stopped spending a lot of time in Norway, but they did an exercise called Trident Juncture off Norway last year, and guess what? It was tough. Some damage, not a lot, some damage to ships. Not quite prepared for the kinds of seas that they were dealing with. And I can tell you from having commanded both the destroyer and a squadron of amphibious ships, or a strike group of amphibious ships, looking at pictures of the snow on the flight deck of an amphib, which is highly unusual, and also pictures of sailors chipping ice off the bow of a destroyer. Wow, we cannot operate in the Arctic if we have to go out and chip all the ice off our ship like they did in, Patrick O'Brien's time. Actually, Patrick O'Brien is a modern person, but in the time of his books, we're going to have to do a little better than that. We, in the past, had ships that had de-icing capabilities. We stopped doing all that. So we're going to have to start again as a Navy and a nation. And of course, I'm a naval officer, so I tend to divert to that. But there are big changes in our future if we want to participate in a changing climate world. And it's not just ice-free Arctic, it's excessive drought in other regions, it's drying up of lakes that were major social, political, and economic centers in Africa. It's extreme temperatures and wildfire in Australia, in northern Finland, in our own country that we are going to have to deal with in our future. And to me, the sadness and the tragedy of the recurring theme that you hear on the news as you watch all this happening is every single person they interview says, it's the worst fire I ever saw, it came on the fastest, it was the hardest, the waters came up the highest. This is from Virginia Beach last summer. We've never had this much water before. It never came up overnight. It never came up this far. Every storm is a new adventure, and every challenge seems to be more dramatic. We'll see how long that continues. So, whoops, wrong way. I'm off to a great start. In the context of national security, this is from a selected vulnerability assessment report that was actually released early in 2018 by the Department of Defense. They did a survey, and it turns out in reporting from the Washington Post that they did not insist that people respond, so they got quite a number of responses, and you can see the chart on your right is the ones that did not respond, and the chart on the left is people who did, and you can see they're kind of similar. But the response rate was 50%, and the 50% who responded all said they were impacted by climate in some way. Drought, sea level rise, wildfires, water shortages. So what's interesting about that is what happened to the other 50%, and what was the context of some of our facilities overseas. So the good news is we know there's an impact. The challenge is, why do we not have more of an understanding of this from a federal perspective? But I would say the good news is, the only person who got it right was Puerto Rico, by the way. They all responded. But you can pretty well rest assured that if you're in Florida, you're going to be impacted. And so what are the challenges from a national security perspective in that regard, and what do we have to do to prepare? And of course, all of this is going to lead to money, and there's a great reluctance, both at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level, to kind of have these conversations, because we're very concerned about what the costs will be. That's a problem for the state. It's a problem for the nation. On the other hand, the longer we wait to make change, the fewer options we will have, and the more costly those options will become. So there is a need for action. And you can see just from looking at the United States not the territories aren't even included here, but they also have challenges, particularly in the South Pacific, that there's certainly a clear impact to most, if not all, national security facilities. So I like to talk about Hampton Roads. I live there, although now in my current position, I have to be careful to include the broader state coastal region, and so I shall. We'll get there. But I think the point I would like to make to you about Hampton Roads is how unique the area is from the federal presence that's there in the interest of tying in the national security piece, and also how vulnerable it is. So we're really a crucible for the challenges of what's happening here. The land's sinking, the waters are rising. We have the fastest rate of change on the East Coast, driven by those two factors, not just one. And we have this enormous federal presence. 29 separate federal entities are represented in the region. 2/3 of the federal presence there is military, and 3/4 of that is Navy. The significance to that is a lot of those things can't go somewhere else. It's the only place where we build aircraft carriers in the country, the only place where we refuel aircraft carriers in the country, one of 2 submarine construction facilities, the largest naval base in the world, among other unique facilities. There's large Air Force presence, there's a large Army presence, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, all of its boats are there. The Army has a lot of boats. They're all at Fort Eustis, they're all vulnerable, but of course they have to be on the water, so they're going to be close to some of the challenges that we face. We also have Wallops Island Missile Test Range on the eastern shore in the Chincoteague area, one of the only active missile test fire range for the Navy on the East Coast is there, along with Virginia Spaceport and, of course, NASA Wallops facility. So an active launch area on Wallops Island, which is a coastal barrier island, extremely vulnerable. So 1.2 billion of the state's GDP coming out of Wallops Island, and it's right on the front lines of what is in our future. Virginia is the state with the highest percentage of GDP being derived from DoD presence, 8.9% nationwide. We also have the highest percentage of defense personnel spending in the country, and we're second behind California in defense contracts and private defense contracts. So whether we like it or not in this state, we are tied to the Defense Department in a lot of ways. So what happens to us impacts them, and that impacts the much broader national security apparatus. So there's some truths. See what my next slide is here. Okay, shows a great slide from Hampton's Resilient Hampton Phase 1 report, which was put out in January of last year. It's now a year old, and they're all about ready to put out Phase 2, although they haven't done it yet. But this shows you the location of some of the federal facilities, and the takeaway is they're in a lot of the vulnerable areas, and there sure are a lot of them. And I like to talk about kind of truths about the challenges we face in coastal adaptation and protection in the region, and really in the state. This is an existential threat for us, for coastal Virginia. The impact to government presence, the Port of Virginia, enormous port, impact past the Mississippi River on the East Coast, commodities come in, agricultural products go out, and it is the largest coal export point on the East Coast. So you can love coal or you can hate coal, but most of what's leaving the country from the East Coast is going out of Hampton Roads. The rate of acceleration that we're dealing with make us very unique. And the huge vessel presence and the huge port presence, plus our tourism industry, plus waterfront property, which drives a lot of the economy for the individual cities, all make us very, very vulnerable. And we can't just isolate the federal facilities or the port. All the people that live and work in these facilities are spread throughout the region. 65% of the people in Hampton Roads alone live in one city and work in another. And if you've spent a lot of time there, you know it's flat and it all looks the same. So there's this big transfer of people every day, and we're dealing with bridges and tunnels and bridge tunnels and huge traffic and all the things that go with those kinds of bottlenecks, I guess you would say. But although VDOT we're going to expand Hampton HRBT, yes we are, it's coming. But will that really solve all of that problem? Probably not, but at least it will be a start. You can see from the chart on your left how low we are regionally, and you can see what the impacts are with an 8-foot and a 13-foot storm surge in the other chart, and what the impacts would be to some of those federal facilities. So back to my truths. We have a water-based economy, which we've talked about. We don't yet have a water management economy. There's a lot of interest in that. There's sort of a sense that because we're so vulnerable, people will want to come and help us solve our problem. And they will if we can identify what we want to do ourselves to solve our problem. No big engineering firm is going to roll into Hampton Roads and say, great, I want to build you a wall, until you've figured out how you want to prepare yourself and where you want to apply funding. And then you can invite interesting strategies in to help you solve the problem you have identified that you want to correct in an innovative and creative way. So we have to be careful. This is always my caution, not to put the cart before the horse. Until we know what we want to do, we're not going to get a lot of people to come help us do it. We need to figure that out for ourselves. We need to understand what's critical and vulnerable, make our plan, and that is part of what my job is to create that plan. I should also mention that the port is one of the Maritime Administration's 17 critical infrastructure ports, and there are only a few of them on the East Coast, so that makes this even more valuable in that context. Coastal Virginia does understand what's happening to it, but we're struggling for long-term revisioning. We're struggling to understand that the Hampton Roads of today will be different in the future. Cities are at different places in understanding that, but that's really true across the state. Some of the planning district commissions on the coast understand this and are taking action, others less so. And because we have very rural districts and very urban suburban districts, there's a disparity in that context too. Fortunately, under the Water Resources Development Act of 2018, we do now have permission to study the entire coast at once. That's a challenge for those of you who know anything about the Army Corps. We had been going city by city by city. That is not going to lead to a holistic solution. Now we can do more to combine studies and get more work done, which is great. The other challenge that I find, and I talked to mentioned it, I think, a little bit earlier today with some of the students that I was talking with, who had excellent questions, by the way, was that as you look at sea level rise scenario planning curves, that NOAA's curves are very aggressive, and the Army Corps' curves are very conservative. So they are all showing rise, but they're showing it at different degrees. And if you want any matching funds out of the Army Corps, you have to use their curves. So is that the right thing? Are we on the right track there? Are they too low? Is NOAA too aggressive? What's the right answer? I don't know the right answer, but I keep asking the question, and people do listen occasionally, and so hopefully we can sort of make some progress there to get to a happy medium of what we should be thinking about as a state as we move forward. Finally, the strategy of waiting for the next big flooding event to stimulate funding is not going to be a very good strategy. However, many people seem to think that is what we should do. I'm only going to show this quickly because it's not worth looking at for a very long period of time, but you can see from looking at this that there's a lot of federal stuff in Hampton Roads. That's all I want to show you from that context. For the scientists in the room, this is what we're dealing with. These are slides Dr. Larry Atkinson kind of keeps at ODU and keeps putting together. But what you can see by looking at this is from the late 90s on, we have seen a sharp incidence in the increased levels and depth and duration of nuisance flooding, which is 0.53 meters above mean high water. And as we get to the end of the 2020 line there, you can see that the mean high water nuisance flooding line, which is the black line, is about to intersect every high tide cycle. We're not there yet, but we're getting there quickly. Some places especially in the peninsula as well, and also on the eastern shore, and also the middle peninsula, we are already seeing many high tide cycles, and certainly every lunar high tide cycle, we are achieving or exceeding the nuisance flood level. So what does that impact? Hampton Boulevard, major thoroughfare into Naval Station, Norfolk. Shore Drive, major thoroughfare into Little Creek, Fort Story, which is where we do a lot of special operations training and where we have all of our amphibious ships. That's just Hampton Roads. This year, for the first time, Matthews County closed schools for sunny day flooding. In 2018 was the first year that happened. Hadn't happened up until then, but it will happen again. We know this. Next, just to show that it's not only an urban challenge, and I do love the coastal PDCs. If somebody read the Virginia Pilot Monday, you read an article where the more rural PDCs were complaining bitterly that no one cared about them. We do care about them. It's not just an urban challenge. Both kinds of regions have different things in their favor. For the rural areas, they have space, which that cities like Norfolk and Virginia Beach don't necessarily have. but they also have less money, and they have, as a result, less options at their disposal. On the left, on your right left side is Matthews County, Middle Peninsula. You can see it's extremely low. It's also on the edge of the Meteor Crater. Somebody was talking about the Meteor Crater earlier. Who was that? In the not too distant past, really only about 25 years ago, a meteor crater was discovered. Really, it's at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and this is part of the rim on the western side of the crater. That does have some impact in the subsidence issues that we deal with, although it is not by no means. There's also isostatic adjustment, and which is tectonic plate shifting and aquifer depletion. Those three things contribute very unevenly, I might add, to subsidence in the region. In particular, though, the two places where we have had paper mills, West Point and Franklin, that's where the most subsidence is taking place. And that's not a big surprise because they use, or did in the past, use all kinds of water. The eastern shore, as you can see, is also quite vulnerable. Fortunately, Route 13 runs up the spine, but for those who aren't sure where Wallops is, this is the Wallops Island Test Facility here. So you can see this is all marsh, and there's a causeway that comes out here, and then this is the only missile test facility the Navy has on the East Coast. And it's not the only place we launch rockets on the East Coast, but it's a significant contributor to the state of Virginia. Very unique infrastructure, and it is right on the front line. So lots of challenges in our future in dealing with urban issues as well. This year, the governor, November 2nd of 2018, the governor signed out Executive Order 24, which is really, in his quote here, a roadmap to make our built environment more resilient. It's focused on three specific sections. The first is to set statewide standards for built infrastructure. Right now we're focusing on buildings. Eventually we'll get to roads. VDOT is not the root of all evil. But they do have all the money, and that's fair because they have such a tremendous job. But first we're looking at built infrastructure, setting sea level rise scenario curve planning standards and setting base flood elevation standards. And we'll move on from there, and those will also be provided to the cities as recommendations for things they might choose to implement. Second, the development of a coastal resilience master plan. And finally, the ability to improve statewide cross-agency coordination and collaboration. I'm in the process of pulling together all the pre-disaster mitigation programs that the state has. And actually, my assistant intern and fellow, I guess it's sort of a fellow internship, Leslie Morton is here. She's just started yesterday, and she's going to help me do that. And the challenge will be, we've already found things that people didn't know existed, and we've had agencies tell us, no, we don't have anything, and then, yep, they actually do, so they aren't really thinking about it in a holistic way. And we found things, or know of things, where we're almost working at cross purposes, which is what we want to try to avoid, which is why we're trying to pull all this together and understand what we have. So probably long overdue in many cases. And it will be a big step forward for the state because we'll be able to better align ourselves with and show alignment for federal entities as we try to figure out ways that we're going to get money to deal with all of this. Resilience legislation, I just want to touch on this a little because we made some improvements in this year's General Assembly. There's always opportunities to do more. The building, by the way, is part of a really interesting program that the Middle Peninsula PDC runs, called Public Access Authority. It can be done anywhere. Some other PDCs have something similar, but the Middle Peninsula has done this most aggressively. Basically, they've set up a way for properties at a certain value to qualify for tax incentives to turn over their property to the Public Access Authority, and then it remains the property of that Public Access Authority, and it allows public access. What the challenge is, though, as you can see from this property, which is valued at over $1 million, you're stuck with the house. So you have to decide whether you want to try to use that property as something that can also generate additional revenue for the planning district to help them manage this process, or do you want to raise it and use it in some other way? But the other thing that we are hopeful, and this is the Middle Peninsula Planning District's idea, and that we're hoping we'll be able to use these properties for, is as test beds for things like solving the septic tank problem in areas where we are starting to see more and more recurrent rising groundwater or recurrent flooding, and other kinds of challenges that rural communities will be dealing with. We have lots of areas here that we can use to try to test things out to find solutions for them, and we're hoping to be able to take advantage of that. And the Sea Grant within the state of Virginia is working on ways that we can start to use that. So there is a process already underway that the Sea Grant in the Middle Peninsula and Go Virginia Regions 5 and 6 have coordinated on to start using some of these facilities in this context. We do have a Shoreline Resilience Fund. It was funded, well, it was never funded. It still hasn't been funded, but it was created in 2016. Someday we will get money into that. The Coastal Protection Act, which was presented to the General Assembly this year, would have taken Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative carbon tax dividends and put them in some part into the Resilience Fund. It was not successful and did not become legislation, so we're still without money in the Resilience Fund, but we will get there. Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flooding Resiliency, ODU, VIMS, Virginia Coastal Policy Center, was created in 2017. That entity looks at and pulls in other universities to look at recurrent flooding challenges. My position was created in 2018. This year, the General Assembly did pass what I refer to as Referendum 1. It was on the ballot last fall, but basically allowing cities to provide a tax incentive for resilience initiatives on built properties that exist prior to the passage of Resolution 1. So that did pass the General Assembly. Cities will be able to do that if they choose to. And another kind of interesting initiative that passed is this CPACE program for taking that from being just an energy efficiency and resilience program into adding resilience with that. That was a request from the city of Norfolk, and Senator Lewis sponsored it from the Eastern Shore, and it actually passed. So this is another way that cities can work with nonprofit entities to find ways to jointly fund resilient solutions for multifamily dwellings and other kinds of multi-use property. So we've also expanded to some extent Slat Funding, which is additional funding for, this is really more of a coastal Chesapeake Bay water quality program that for agriculture, but we've managed to get a little bit of additional money in that, and some badly needed money to finish a study that was started looking at, I showed you the Eastern Shore and the challenges there. Well, we need to have a better understanding of how sand is moving up and down the Eastern Shore. VIMS had started the work. They hadn't been able to finish it. That was also passed by the General Assembly. So in some cases, small steps, but small steps are still steps in the right direction. This slide is kind of the essence of what's happening in Norfolk. This is Surrey Crescent, which is in Larchmont, if anybody's familiar with that area. You could see by looking at it a couple of things. First of all, the houses are largely raised, but not all. That one's been on the cover of the New York Times because they've never been able to either sell it or get the money to raise it. You can see that some are. They're all raised at different levels. This one's for sale, has been since the fall. Last year in September it was $445, now it's $390. Challenges. These are all water-based plants, things that don't grow unless there's a lot of salt water. You can see there's a lot of salt water. And so what is the challenge of this? You can see how flat we are. You can see the cranes in the back. Is it worth it? And as there's more to this. There's on this side, and then there's this side, which you can't see. This is Hampton Roads, Hampton Boulevard over here, floods all the time. So the challenge for cities is when they started raising houses here, raising houses was a good idea. But now, is raising houses a good idea? When you look at them, they're all different levels. So FEMA used to say they need to be 5 feet, they need to be 6 feet, they need to be 10 feet. There are some single-story ranch homes that are kind of behind this picture that are probably 14 feet in the air. I mean, it looks like an eyrie up there, a tiny little house perched on this cinder block monstrous wall. Some of these have sold and changed hands, but look at the long-term challenges. You can't get in and out of your driveway when the road is flooded. You can't get to work. You can't get to school. Maybe you can't get home. How long can the city continue to try to maintain this road? How long can the city continue to provide utilities? All these things are things to think about for our future. And what I come across is people love to think about, raising houses. That's what we got to do. We're going to raise houses. That's a solution in some circumstances. But this is a slow-moving but relentless challenge. It is not going to stop anytime soon, as far as science tells us. So we have to take a long view, and in some cases a long view is raising a home, but in other cases maybe we need to be moving homes, maybe we need to be buying homes, maybe we need to be thinking about other things. And so these are the challenges that every city on the East Coast is going to face if they are not facing them already. And oh, by the way, the West Coast, and Alaska, and Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands. So this is, to me, this demonstrates the need for state and federal alignment with cities and municipalities, because we need a national program to start to deal with this. One little city at a time is progress, but this is a very large, slow-moving, but relentless issue. Another one of my favorite, this is why raising homes is interesting but not always relevant. These are the 10 independent cities in Hampton Roads, so you can see they're all kind of sandwiched in together. And the challenge for residents. This is a restaurant in Pungo. If you've ever been there, you might be familiar with it. Blue Pete's, owned by a couple of young men. They're twins, twin brothers, and I know one of them's wife. She's very involved in actually environmental matters. Actually, both of their wives are. They did a kind of a program on them in the paper last year. This day of this flooding, this fall, these two guys bought this restaurant. They were renting it before. Now they own it. Okay. So congratulations to them. They're going to raise the building, so that will help stop some of the damage. But you have to think to yourself, think about what that means. You just bought, this happened half a dozen times this summer there. How much more of this are we going to put up with? Who's going to insure this? Did someone insure? Obviously they did, or they wouldn't have been able to close on the mortgage. So these things are all in our future. These challenges are what lies ahead for us. And citizens and communities have to make some decisions that are going to be quite difficult in the future. One of the things I talked about earlier, and I'll bring it up again, so the students have already heard this, but there is a tension between what's best for individuals, communities, and what the cities want. The choices and the range of choices that we need to give homeowners and individuals are in direct conflict with what cities want, because most of these choices for homeowners mean the home gets moved, or maybe it gets raised, or it gets bought out. And so those choices all for a city mean I'm losing revenue. I might lose the occupants, I'm going to lose their tax revenue, I'm going to lose their real estate property taxes, and I might be left with property that I then have to maintain, and that's a cost to me. So there's a tension here, and we have to start working through this tension and talking about it so that we can come up with solutions that benefit both individuals and cities, so that we can concentrate our development but start to have options so people have other choices if they want them. This slide is done by a friend of mine, a man in Hampton Roads who, before I took this job, was just like me, a public citizen, a former naval officer, self-educated on this. This is the 1933 storm, which is kind of our storm of record. It doesn't have a name. It's the 1933 storm, overlaid on today's sea level rise. So you can see, again, what the impacts are. And what he calls this is the folly of planning for one city alone. So great slide in that context. And the way we will move forward with this is communicating, coordinating, and collaborating to make a joint plan for the state. That's my job, and that's what we're going to do. As citizens of the coast in Virginia, we have this responsibility to prepare to adapt ourselves to this future with water. We have this unprecedented risk, but also an unprecedented amount of foresight. We know what's coming, or we have a very good idea, and we can begin to make plans now to give ourselves more options to mitigate impacts, not only in our local area, in our region, on our coast, our state, and our nation. Our future depends on this, and really the future of our children and our grandchildren depends on this also. So my last slide, I love to collect interesting slides dealing with flooding, and this one, there is a pig. And so that's not something you see every day. You might see it in Pungo, which is a little bit more rural. But time and tide wait for no man. And Geoffrey Chaucer's quote, but it's certainly applicable in the context of what we're dealing with as a nation, as a state, and as a coastal region in Hampton Roads. So, and you can see from this pig, this is a pet pig. He is sleeping on a pillow. He probably spends a lot of time, or she, right there. So that's my new favorite picture. This was my previous favorite picture. So there's your national security impact right there. The kids are laughing. You know, his car is probably over here stalled, and this happens all the time. So, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, if anybody has any.
Yes, sir.
What's going on up on Tangier right now, as far as the state is concerned?
Tangier is.
Could you just repeat the...
So what's going on in Tangier Island? So did anybody read Chesapeake Requiem? Yeah, excellent book if you haven't read it. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's an excellent book. Very well done. And they are getting in a jetty, which is discussed in the book. The state put up the non-federal match for that. It is kind of tied to navigation work, and that's in progress. So what I can't tell you is if they're actually putting stone in the water yet, but they wanted a jetty to kind of block off the harbor from the north, and they're getting that. That's in progress. Whether they will ever get to a 3x3x3, which is also discussed in the book, I do not know. I do not know. Because let's talk about how the Army Corps does this. They look at the cost of the correction, whatever that might be, versus the cost of the economic impact protected by that work. Less than 500 people live on Tangier Island. So there are things that can be done that are cost effective, but they're all going to be natural and nature-based features. And so the vision of we're just going to wall in Tangier and protect it forever won't meet that set of criteria. I think Tangier understands that. They are looking for some help to give them some time, and the jetty will help them with that. It'll protect their harbor longer. We'll see. It's an interesting challenge. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, though. I have not been out there. I've never been there. Never been to Smith either. I'm kind of a native Marylander, but I've never been to Smith. And I'll get there, but I want to have a reason to go and not just show up and stare. I think that's inappropriate. So the reason will come up. The reason will come up. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you plan what to do when you really don't have a grasp of how much sea level rise you're looking at?
You do what we're going to do for state buildings. You pick a curve that you will use as a intermediate potential solution based on the best available science. So we're looking at taking probably NOAA's intermediate curve, probably. We haven't decided that yet. VIMS has just presented us their recommendation. But long-term, looking at that curve, it's the closest to what Sewell's Point is showing as actual data, including the vast kind of disparities in not only day-to-day, but month-to-month, cyclic over the year. And then you look at it every 5 years and decide whether you're planning to the right curve or not. Hampton Roads Planning District picked a series of elevations over time frames. So this October, all 17 cities, in a miracle, agreed to a series of curves, 1.5 feet, 3 feet, and 4.5 feet. And they gave them 1.5 additional feet by 2030 to 2060-ish, 3 feet by 2060 to 2080, and then as high as 4.5 feet by 2080 to past the turn of the century. So they'll go back and look at that in a few years' time and see if that's reasonable. And if it isn't, if it's excessive, if we don't see that much change, then great. Then they can hold their own and they don't need to make a change. If they're behind, if we see that we're behind what's actually happening, maybe we want to use a higher standard. And it also depends on how much risk you want to accept. Can you tolerate a road being flooded some of the time or never? Well, if the answer is never, then you need to plan to a more extreme curve because you want to take less risk. If you don't care if the road floods, then you can take more risk. It's just up to you to decide what you want to do. So that's really our challenge: is what's vulnerable and what's critical. And so in that context, What do we absolutely have to protect, defend, or retreat from so we don't have the problem, versus where can we tolerate water? Where can we have, water? Can I deal with 5 feet in my backyard? Sure, because the house is almost 10 feet above sea level, and so the water will come up some, but it won't come all the way. But the problem is when the storm comes, then I got a lot more water. So all of those things have to be considered.
I guess what worries me is that if like Norfolk Naval Base, if there's a level where you cannot address above a certain level, and you don't know if you really don't know if you're going to get to that level in 30 years or 60 years, and if you address like less than 5 feet rise in say 40 years, if you get more than that, all the money that you have spent in addressing under 5 feet is wasted.
It's wasted.
Yeah, that's what worries me.
So that's why you pick a modest curve, not the lowest, not the highest, and that's why you spot and adjust. That's why you keep reevaluating it over time to see whether you're following that or whether you are below it, or, like I said, you could be above it. But you also have to consider storm surge. That gets into the amount of risk you're willing to accept. And the challenge for a place like Hampton Roads is we have to do that for all the infrastructure. And so picking the curve and allowing us to lay over top of it, here's the low end, here's the high end, here's the storm surge, what's vulnerable, then start looking at, well, what are our options to protect that we want to protect, or move it, or adapt it to be able to tolerate water in and around it some of the time. It is extremely complex. And in some ways, the rural communities, it's a little simpler for them because there's less to protect, but they still have to get to school, they still have to get to work. I mean, roads are really the most critical issue in a lot of the rural communities. And there are places on the Eastern Shore now and the Middle Peninsula where people get cut off because the town is high, but the road, they have no access in or out. Saxus is one of them, which is across the peninsula from Wallops Island. They're out there all by themselves at the end of a long, low road. But they have a fire station. That's a good thing. They have some capacity to protect themselves. Yes, ma'am.
In response to the article by John Boyer of the Richmond Times-Dispatch demonstrating that Virginia is warming, yesterday's correspondent of the day explained how the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, recently introduced in the House, would effectively reduce carbon dioxide emissions, create jobs, and spur innovation. It meets the solution requirements expressed by Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus of raising the price on carbon with increasing stringency over time and universal participation. In addition to the obvious need for infrastructure work to protect our military bases, do we also have as a nation an obvious need to pursue such bipartisan congressional legislation to reduce the carbon emissions that are driving sea level rise?
So, are you from the Center for Climate and Security? I mean, from CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby. How did I know that?
I thought you might.
So, an excellent organization that's working very hard to make progress here and has really tried to pull together bipartisan solutions, the House Climate Solutions Caucus, that I actually personally do not know the status of post the most recent election, but and you're referring to the Green New Deal.
No, it's not the Green New Deal. This is a
So, are you referring to Virginia or to national?
national.
National,
This
okay.
was introduced in the House a month ago, so by Ted Deutsch.
Right, that's the Green New Deal, I think. It's kind of a nickname for it, but.
I think it's different.
Well, so many entities, including the state of Virginia during the last General Assembly, which I talked about briefly, have looked at carbon tax and carbon fee and dividend And of course, Citizens Climate Lobby is a key proponent of a version of that. And in Virginia, our interest is in joining, being a participant in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the 10 northeastern states down to Maryland. Virginia would be the 11th state and the first southern is a relative term, low mid-Atlantic state to join. However, joining RGGI was proposed in the LAT 2018 General Assembly and was voted down. It was proposed in the 2019 General Assembly and voted down. And in fact, legislation was passed to prohibit the state from joining, even though now the Department of Environmental Quality has actually set up regulations for us to be able to participate, even if we aren't able to take any of the income. And it all goes back to those who own the fossil fuel emitting power plants or fossil fueled power generating plants. So there are lots of different ways this can be done. If it is helpful in reducing carbon emissions, it is of course important. And I can tell you from the military's perspective, there's an interest in reducing the use of fuel because it buys you battle space. If you're burning less gas, you can stay on station longer. If you don't have to have fuel convoys, an awful lot of people are not at risk in a land conflict, which we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Where do we lose most of our people? Guarding convoys. What did the Navy do a lot of? 14,000 people on the ground, running fuel convoys, and guarding prisons and guarding other things. But we lost an awful lot of people doing that. General Mattis at the time, free us from the burden of the tether of fuel. So a lot of research and development went into figuring out ways to have solar power, to give forward operating bases, other ways to generate power, such that they were not constantly relying on fuel and generators. So a considerable amount of innovation actually took place there and will continue to take place under President Obama and the previous Secretary of Defense and at the time Secretary of the Navy for Energy Installations and the Environment, Vice Admiral Denny McGinn, retired. A tremendous amount of work went into looking at alternative fuel, power sources for federal facilities. It's a public-private partnership. It was a win-win for both. Military's got unused space. Power companies want opportunities to, give themselves other choices for power generation, cleaner power generation sites. So maybe it's a good place for geothermal. Maybe it's a good place for a solar array. And we have some. Oceana has a solar array now. A number of activities in that context did take place under the last administration because it not only did it provide revenue, and sometimes they were almost like a trade system where Dominion, as one example, would provide additional power lines to a facility in return for being able to put a solar array on that facility, from which then generated power and gave them more options. So the military has also looked at microgrid technology. Some of that's been done on the West Coast. They're looking at doing it in other places just to give themselves more stability and more options, and also in some cases to give them the opportunity to be an independent power generator, particularly in a time of emergency where maybe there's a hurricane and a facility's in the path and they have the capacity to take care of themselves from an emergency power perspective, so they aren't a draw on the local system, which is needed to support emergency power in the region and other areas that have been impacted. So there has been quite a bit of work there done, particularly by the military, in the context of not only energy innovation, but also energy reducing energy dependency, energy independence, and reducing the use of energy in not only mobile forces, but in shore facilities as well. So Hampton Roads is actually a test platform, Naval Station Norfolk, for a program that will give them kind of an automated way to look at their power use base-wide and to be able to target areas that are high generators and figure out why, and then solve those problems. So they've also had an opportunity now, the Navy in particular, post 9/11, every building that was built had to be built to very high security standards and very high, I'm not using the right word, really protected standards. They all had to be built to withstand very high potential damage impacts from the context of a bomb threat or that sort of thing. So that meant that the cost benefit to, say, replace windows in a lot of older military facilities, and hey, we've got a lot of old military facilities, you could never meet a cost benefit analysis because the windows were so darn expensive that were needed to meet these force protection requirements. That has now been waived for facilities inside the fence line. So now we can meet cost benefit requirements. And so, because I know this is all from the Naval Facilities and Engineering Command, but they are now seeing opportunities to do a whole lot more energy efficiency work on the bases to help reduce excessive power use. And believe me, in places like Norfolk, some of those buildings are quite old. The building is sound. If we could just replace the windows, we'd be in a lot better shape. So upgrade the windows, upgrade the HVAC, and suddenly you're in a whole different place as far as your efficiency. Then when you change the lighting inside to LED, then you see another whole level of drop. So, and again, Norfolk Naval Station is a test bed for this kind of interesting system. So the military is interested in this. It is a part of their readiness. And again, for the active forces, it buys you battle space, and for the infrastructure, it saves you money. And so from that perspective, it's always of interest because we're always trying to save money on fuel. I can tell you, being a chief engineer on a ship, there are standards you have to burn to, and if you're exceeding them, you get in trouble, because I did. So.
Time for one more. With their work with the state legislature and then with these coastal, rural regions, and then with the military, do you run into any resistance by people who perhaps don't believe in climate change? And how do you address, how do you talk to these people?
Well, I live in a neighborhood in Virginia, in Norfolk, where a lot of people don't believe in climate change. But they will all acknowledge, they believe the climate is changing. They don't believe it's human caused. But they all will acknowledge we are seeing changes in Hampton Roads, and we have a tremendous flooding problem. And when you talk about it in that context, the thing that's impacting them personally, and talk about making changes to correct those issues, flooding in our case most of the time, torrential rains, erosion, they want to see action in that context. So that doesn't help the energy mitigation particularly, because sometimes they don't see a need for that. But to me, if I can take action in any way to start to adapt, I'll get to the rest of it over time. Or there'll be a national program, or there'll be a state program, and we'll be able to move forward kind of in a different way. But to me, if I can, the ability to reach people, find out what really is impacting them. Same thing's true with farmers. What's your problem? Too much rainfall. Okay, how do we solve? We can't solve the rainfall, but how can we help you deal with the runoff, store some of that rainfall for later when you need it, or find, I'll give an example from the, Minnesota has done a climate assessment. Red state, not a lot of, Montana, red state, not a lot of interest in climate change as an entity perhaps in the state, but huge farming state, a lot of wheat grown, and all the farmers realizing that the weather patterns had changed, and then they weren't able to grow the crops that they had traditionally grown at the times that they traditionally grew them. So in the context of that work being presented to them by was a woman scientist at the University of Montana who's doing this work, she focused on what impacted them and where did they need help. And they were desperate for information about how they could plant wheat and what kind of wheat they should be planting that would survive the conditions they were now experiencing. And so they were all, she did a lot of outreach, but it was all targeted at where are the people and what do they need. And so they ended up with tremendous support for this statewide climate assessment because it was targeted. So my lesson from that was, we have to make sure we're really focusing on targeting where people have a need and being able to move forward in that context. And the rest of it will come. And I know that doesn't satisfy the ardent environmentalists, but we got to start somewhere. So that's my answer.
So we're out of time. Let's thank Ann.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.